In the middle of that night, the heart monitor in the recovery room let out one long, abnormal beep, then went silent, and the man who had spoken words of blasphemy less than 6 hours earlier stood frozen in the hospital corridor, blood still on his hands, staring into the reflection in the window glass, a face he did not recognize for the first time in his life. Grace Memorial Hospital sat at the edge of a mid-sized city, where the late-year rains tended to drag on for days, gray as a mourning cloth draped over old rooftops. Directly across from the main entrance stood a small parish church, its whitewashed walls peeling, its bell tower leaning slightly with age. But the bell that rang every evening at 6 o'clock was as steady as the heartbeat of the whole neighborhood. People said that bell had been ringing since their grandfather's time, back when the road in front of the hospital was still dirt, back before the hospital was even built. Only the church had stood there, quietly, watching generation after generation come into the world and leave it. Dr. Marcus Cole, chief of neurosurgery, was a man the entire hospital both admired and feared. Admired for his rare, gifted hands, cases that seemed hopeless could still turn around under his care. Feared for a coldness bordering on cruelty, for the line he liked to repeat to younger colleagues: "There are no miracles here, only technique and precision. Anyone who believes in anything else is lying to themselves." Marcus had grown up in a household where his father was a physician and his mother a pharmacist. From childhood he was taught that everything in the world could be reduced to a formula, a probability, numbers that spoke for themselves. At 20 he had watched his grandmother die in a hospital bed, her lips moving in prayer until her final breath. And she died anyway, in pain, alone, no miracle arriving to save her. From that day on, a conviction hardened in him like iron. Religion was nothing but a sedative for the weak, a warm blanket people wrapped themselves in, so they wouldn't have to face the raw truth that death was simply the end, nothing more. That afternoon, rain poured over the city in sheets, lightning tearing across a bruised purple sky. The emergency department at Grace Memorial was jammed after a highway bus crash. Amid the rushing crowd, an elderly woman named Rose, her hair pure white, her frame thin and worn, knelt in the middle of the corridor, both hands clutching a small wooden statue of the Virgin Mary, her lips trembling through broken fragments of prayer. Her only grandson, a 23-year-old named Daniel, had just been rushed into emergency surgery for a severe traumatic brain injury after his motorcycle was struck and thrown in the storm. Rose had raised Daniel since he was small, after his parents died in a house fire. To her, that boy was everything she had left in the world, the reason she woke up each morning, the last thread of faith she still held on to. Dr. Cole strode down the corridor, his pace quick, his face drawn tight from a surgery that had just ended after 4 grueling hours, his body worn thin, his nerves stretched like a violin string about to snap. He stopped short when he saw the old woman kneeling, blocking the path, a flash of irritation crossing his eyes. In that moment, only one thought occupied his mind. If the young man's surgery failed, people would surely say it was because God hadn't shown mercy, not because medicine had its limits, and the mere prospect of being measured against some invisible being stirred a fierce professional pride in him. "Ma'am, please stand up. This is a hospital, not a place to kneel," he said, his voice dry as stone grinding on stone. Rose looked up, her eyes red and swollen, her voice breaking. "Please, doctor, I only have God and you to trust in. Please have mercy and save him. He's all I have left in this world." That sentence, meant as a genuine expression of trust, struck the sharpest nerve in Marcus without her ever meaning to. He looked down at the small wooden statue in her hands, its face carved plainly, the paint long since worn and flaking. A surge of anger, built up over days of overwork, of pressure to save one case after another, suddenly ignited in him like an uncontrolled flame. "You believe in this piece of wood? Can it hold a scalpel? Can it read a CT scan? Your grandson's life right now isn't in the hands of this statue. It's in the hands of people who spent over a decade training to know how to save lives. Do you understand?" With that, in a rare moment of losing control, a man who had always prided himself on composure, Marcus reached out and snatched the statue from her hands, holding it up before the horrified eyes of everyone around them. "This is just a piece of wood someone carved and gave a name to. Don't fool yourself into thinking it can save anyone." "Doctor, please don't," Rose cried out, lunging forward, but it was too late. In one impulsive moment, one he would be haunted by for months afterward, Marcus's grip tightened, and he wrenched it apart. A dry crack echoed through the corridor, and the noise around them fell suddenly, completely silent. The wooden statue snapped in two, the head flying off, rolling across the tile floor before coming to rest, face down. The entire hallway seemed to freeze. A young nurse standing nearby clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide, unable to believe what she'd just witnessed. Marcus tossed the broken half at the old woman's feet, his voice flat and cold. "You'd be better off spending your time signing the surgical consent form instead of sitting here crying and blocking the hallway." Then he turned and strode toward the operating room, leaving behind the choked sobs of a woman who had just lost the one thing helping her stay upright in the most desperate hour of her life. Outside, right at that moment, the bell across the street began to ring, marking 6 o'clock. But today the tone rang longer than usual, deeper, strangely mournful, as though grieving for what had just happened. For a brief instant, Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, but he shook it off immediately, telling himself it was simply exhaustion. He had no idea that the moment the wooden statue shattered on the tile floor was also the moment a strange chain of events, quiet but unstoppable, began working its way into every corner of his life, like a verdict written long ago, waiting only for the right moment to be carried out. Operating Room 4 blazed under surgical lights. Daniel, 23, lay motionless on the table, his skull fractured from the impact, a blood clot pressing against his brain at an alarming rate. Marcus took his position, his hands regaining their familiar steadiness, though inside, the aftertaste of his earlier rage still lingered, like a burn that hadn't yet cooled. "Blood pressure's dropping, doctor," the anesthesia nurse reported, tension in her voice. "More fluids. Prep blood," Marcus ordered, his hands already moving decisively along the incision on the patient's scalp. The whine of the bone drill cut through the air, mixing with the drumming rain outside. No one in the room spoke an unnecessary word. All attention was fixed on every centimeter of the exposed skull. Out in the hallway, Rose sat huddled on a cold plastic chair, her trembling hands trying to fit the two broken halves of the statue back together. Even though she knew the crack would remain forever, she had stopped crying. She simply moved her lips silently, repeating the same prayer over and over, like a thin thread she clung to amid the storm of her fate. Inside the operating room, things suddenly took a turn for the worse. The heart rhythm on the monitor began to spike erratically, jagged, chaotic lines replacing what had been a steady beat moments before. "V-fib! Prep the defibrillator!" Marcus shouted, his voice sharpened by extreme tension. The whole team shifted immediately into cardiac arrest protocol, the beeping machines pounding out a rhythm that felt like life and death wrestling for control. In that chaotic instant, a thought flashed through Marcus's mind, sharp as a blade. If this case didn't make it, people would surely whisper that it was because he had insulted the old woman's faith. The thought made him furious with himself, and in that invisible rage, his hands pressed down harder, more decisively than ever. 30 seconds passed, heavy as 30 years. Then, unexpectedly, almost unbelievably, the line on the monitor steadied, a regular rhythm returning as though nothing had happened at all. "Doctor, he's back. Sinus rhythm," the nurse cried out, her voice breaking with relief. Marcus exhaled, but in his eyes flickered a doubt he couldn't quite name. As a physician with over 15 years of experience, he knew full well the odds of recovery after prolonged V-fib like that were vanishingly small, nearly hopeless. And yet the patient had come back. He told himself it was simply the epinephrine finally taking effect at the right moment. A coincidence of timing, nothing more. The surgery stretched on for nearly 3 more hours. When the last of the clot was finally removed, intracranial pressure dropped to a safe level, the incision was carefully closed, and the entire team was nearly spent. Daniel was transferred to intensive care, critical but stable for now. Marcus pulled off his mask and sank into a chair in the break room, his hands still trembling slightly from the sustained tension. A colleague walked in, looking at him with a mixture of admiration and something harder to name. "Strange case, Marcus. I didn't think we'd keep him." "Nothing strange about it," Marcus replied, his voice retaining its usual coolness. "We just followed protocol correctly. Don't get superstitious on me." But when he stepped out into the hallway, the first thing that met his eyes was Rose, still sitting in the same spot, clutching the broken statue, her gaze fixed painfully on the operating room door. Seeing him emerge, she rose quickly, her voice shaking. "Doctor, how is my grandson?" "He's made it past the critical stage for now, "But we need to monitor him closely over the next several days," he answered, forcing his voice to stay even. Rose broke down sobbing, sinking to her knees right there, lifting the broken statue high like an offering. Thank you, Lord, for your mercy." Marcus felt an irrational irritation rise in him, as if the effort of an entire surgical team, hours of extreme tension, were being unfairly shared with a lifeless piece of wood. He opened his mouth to object, then thought better of it, and simply walked on. As he passed the chair where she had been sitting, his eyes drifted involuntarily down to the broken statue resting carefully on her lap. Under the pale fluorescent light of the hallway, he had the strange sensation that the wooden eyes, which should have been closed, seemed to be opening slightly, looking straight at him with a gaze both sorrowful and stern. He flinched, blinking rapidly, then silently scolded himself. Just an illusion from exhaustion, just a piece of wood, nothing more. But somewhere deep within him, something faintly stirred, like the soft knock of an uninvited visitor standing outside a door he had locked long ago. In the nights that followed, Marcus's life began to unravel in a way no one around him noticed except himself. By day, he remained the cold, decisive Dr. Cole everyone knew, handling one difficult case after another with impressive precision. But at night, nightmares began to visit him, night after night, nearly identical each time. He dreamed he was standing in an endless hospital corridor, fluorescent lights flickering, not a soul in sight. At the end of the hallway stood a closed door, a small wooden cross hanging on it. In the dream he approached, a groundless irritation rising within him, and he reached out and yanked the cross down, snapping it. Instantly, every light in the corridor went out, darkness swallowing everything, leaving only the sound of heavy, slow footsteps drawing near. He turned but saw no one, only the broken half of a wooden statue lying in the middle of the hallway, the severed head rolling beside it, its wooden eyes slowly opening, staring straight into him. From the cracks in the statue's body, a deep red liquid began to seep out, spreading into a pool on the white tile, creeping toward his feet, cold as ice. He tried to scream, but his throat felt gripped shut, no sound escaping. Then a voice, very soft but echoing through the entire space, spoke, "Why did you hurt me?" He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as though he'd just run a great distance. His wife, Elaine, stirred beside him, half asleep. "Bad dream again?" He only muttered, "It's nothing," and turned toward the wall, but his eyes stayed open until dawn. The nightmares weren't the only thing. During the day, small, seemingly harmless details began to unsettle him in ways he'd never noticed before. Once, while examining an elderly patient, he happened to glance at a rosary hanging around her neck, and his gaze lingered longer than usual on the small cross at its end. For a moment, he thought he saw a fine crack running along its tiny surface, identical to the break he had made in Rose's statue. He blinked, looked again. Nothing unusual, just an ordinary cross like any other. "What's wrong with me?" he asked himself, irritation ringing in his own head. One afternoon, after a long shift, Marcus leaned against the railing on the 7th-floor hallway, looking across at the church tower opposite. The 6 o'clock bell rang again, steady as always, but this time each toll seemed to strike directly against his chest, heavy in a way he couldn't explain. In the churchyard below, a group of parishioners was praying the rosary, prayer books in hand, their faces strangely at peace. Marcus pursed his lips, thinking, nothing but superstition, but he couldn't deny a truth quietly taking root in his subconscious. Whenever he faced a case severe enough that all his medical knowledge seemed powerless, some small, deep corner of his mind would flicker with a thought he refused to admit even to himself, a longing for someone stronger than himself to be present in that room with him. The strange chain of events reached its peak on another night shift. Marcus was sitting, writing up patient notes, when he heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. The door burst open, and a young nurse named Lena stepped in, her face pale. "Dr. Cole, the patient, Daniel, the one you operated on. He just woke up." Marcus looked up, momentarily stunned. "He's awake? Are you sure?" "Yes, I just checked." He called for his grandmother, very clearly. "But there's something strange, doctor." He said he saw a stranger in the ICU. Marcus frowned. "A stranger? Who could sneak into the ICU?" Lena shook her head. "I don't know. He said it was a man in white, standing at the foot of the bed, with wounds on his hands like he'd been nailed there." An image flashed instantly through Marcus's mind. The wooden statue of the Virgin and Child that he had broken, and in his thoughts that image blurred together with the religious stories he had always dismissed. He quickly pushed the thought away, snapping, "Fine, take me down there. Don't say anything strange in front of the patient." But deep in his eyes, a faint flicker of fear had already begun to take hold. Stepping into the intensive care unit, Marcus tried to maintain the composed expression of a doctor long accustomed to the thin line between life and death. Daniel lay in the bed, his face still gaunt, but his eyes now held a clear, conscious light. Beside him, Rose gripped her grandson's hand, crying and laughing at once, murmuring words of gratitude without pause. Seeing Marcus enter, she stood quickly, her eyes brimming. "Doctor, thank you so much. God used your hands to save my grandson." Marcus was about to brush the comment aside as he always had, but when his eyes met Daniel's, the words caught in his throat. The young man looked at him with an expression both grateful and searching, as if waiting for something. "Doctor," Daniel spoke, his voice still hoarse. "You're the one who operated on me, right?" Marcus nodded. "That's right, but you need to rest now. Don't talk too much." Daniel shook his head slightly, reaching for the doctor's hand, his thin, trembling fingers closing around it before Marcus could pull away. "I have to say it now. If I don't, I'm afraid I'll forget. It's important." Marcus signaled for Lena to keep monitoring the vitals, then pulled up a chair beside the bed. "All right, but just a few minutes. Take your time." Daniel looked straight into his eyes, speaking slowly. "When the pain was worst, everything went dark, and I thought I had died. I was walking through a long tunnel, cold, empty, no one there. I was scared. I called for my grandmother, but no one answered." Marcus listened, keeping the posture of someone receiving an account of a hallucination caused by oxygen deprivation to the brain, a phenomenon he'd read about in numerous medical papers. But somehow, his heart was beating faster than it should. Then at the end of the tunnel there was a white light, not blinding, just warm. I walked toward it, and there was a man in white, his arms spread wide, wounds on his hands like nails had gone through them. The words made Rose weep, quickly making the sign of the cross. Nurse Lena, standing behind them, shivered. Marcus frowned but didn't interrupt. He looked at me, not angry, just sad. I asked if I was dead. He smiled and said not yet. My grandmother was crying a lot, and someone was fighting to bring me back, even though that person's heart was very hard right now. I didn't understand. I asked who. He pointed behind me. I turned around and saw the doctor operating on me, sweat pouring down his forehead. Daniel paused, coughing softly from the effort. Marcus meant to tell him to rest, but Daniel pressed on. I turned back to him and he said, "I have stood at that person's door for a long time, but he has locked it himself. If you go back, tell him something for me." "What did he say?" Marcus heard his own voice ask, trembling in a way he didn't recognize. He looked at me, so sad. He said, "I let him break the image of me, but I have never broken him. Tell him that." The room fell into complete silence. Rose sank to her knees by the bed, weeping and murmuring words of thanks. Nurse Lena pressed her lips together, eyes red, and Marcus sat frozen, feeling as though an invisible hand had reached out and gripped his heart tight. He wanted to tell himself this was simply a hallucination from anesthesia, from a brief period of oxygen deprivation to the brain. He had read dozens of studies on near-death experiences, on how the brain could generate vivid experiences when close to death. But there was one detail he couldn't explain away with science. How could Daniel possibly know about the statue being broken in the hallway, when at that moment he was unconscious, being rushed straight into surgery? And Rose had had no opportunity to tell her grandson about it either. Since waking, Daniel had seen no one except doctors, nurses, and his grandmother. Marcus felt a chill run through him. He stood up abruptly, knocking the chair backward with a loud clatter, and every eye in the room turned toward him. "Doctor, I'm sorry if I said something wrong," Daniel stammered, alarmed. "No, it's fine, just rest," Marcus said quickly, waving a hand, forcing his voice to stay calm. "We'll talk about it later." He turned to Rose, gave a few brief instructions, then, without waiting for anyone to respond, turned and walked quickly out of the room. His heart pounded. His hands clenched unconsciously until his knuckles went white. On his way out, Daniel's words echoed over and over in his mind like a refrain he couldn't silence. "I let him break the image of me, but I have never broken him." The sentence felt like an indictment wrapped in mercy, gentle yet razor-sharp, cutting straight through the shell of pride he had spent more than 15 years of practicing medicine building around himself. Passing a corner of the hallway, his eyes fell on a small shelf beside the elevator, where a small statue sat, donated years earlier by a former patient. For some reason, this time he couldn't look away as he usually did. He stopped, gazing for a long moment at the gentle face carved into the wood. In that instant, he realized that the day he broke Rose's statue, he hadn't simply destroyed a piece of wood. He had trampled on something sacred that countless suffering people clung to in their most desperate hours. What frightened him more was that whatever he had mocked hadn't punished him immediately, but had instead patiently, one small knock at a time, been reaching for his heart. And sometimes that patience was more terrifying than any immediate punishment could ever be. In the days that followed, Daniel's recovery progressed almost unbelievably well, regarded throughout the department as a case that had escaped death by the narrowest of margins. Every day, Rose went to the church across the street to attend Mass, then carried a small bouquet of flowers over to the hospital to place at the foot of the statue in the hallway. The sight, repeated daily, left Marcus feeling, each time he passed it, as though something were lodged in his throat. He began speaking less, snapping at staff less often, and his eyes seemed to carry a heavier, more thoughtful weight than before. One night, after his wife and children had gone to sleep, Marcus sat alone in the living room, the television on but unwatched. On the table, a cup of coffee had long gone cold. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, the fragment of wood broken from Rose's statue, which he had unconsciously kept since that day, though he had meant many times to throw it away and had simply forgotten. Looking at the small, worn piece of wood in his palm, he suddenly felt it was a silent piece of evidence, testifying against the very man he had become. "I was wrong," he murmured, for the first time in his life daring to name his own action for what it truly was, an act of desecration. Even not believing I didn't need to violate someone else's faith like that. He stood, took the piece of wood, and stepped out onto the balcony, looking toward the church across the street. Though it was late, the small light in front of the statue in the churchyard still burned, casting a warm golden glow over the figure. A night breeze stirred the leaves. Inside Marcus, a quiet war was being waged. On one side, his proud self, his absolute faith in science, built over an entire lifetime. On the other, the persistent nightmares, Daniel's strange testimony, the eyes of the statue he kept imagining were watching him. At last he sighed, speaking softly to the undefined space before him. "If you're real, give me a sign. I don't want to keep living in this contradiction." Once the words left him, he laughed bitterly at himself, shaking his head. This is insane, a doctor demanding a sign. The next morning, Marcus used a break between rounds to visit Daniel. The young man looked much healthier now, able to sit up and talk normally. "Hey, doctor." Daniel smiled. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, his voice noticeably softer than before. "Much better, thanks. I've been thinking a lot about what I told you. I was afraid you'd think I made it up, but I only told you what I saw." Marcus was silent for a moment, then asked, unexpectedly, "What if I don't believe you?" Daniel looked at him for a long time, his gaze carrying a depth unusual for someone his age. "I didn't believe either, doctor. But when I was dying, what I held on to wasn't knowledge, wasn't my own strength. It was someone far greater than me. I don't think he needs my belief to exist. But if I believe, I see my whole life differently." The young man's simple words touched something deep within Marcus, without either of them fully realizing it. He left with a heavy heart. But this time, it wasn't the heaviness of irritation as before. It was the weight of a man standing at the threshold of a great decision. That afternoon, a chain collision accident occurred on the overpass near the hospital. The entire emergency department was placed on red alert. Marcus threw himself back into the familiar rhythm. Blood, cries, urgent shouts, one surgery bleeding into the next. Among the incoming patients was a girl of about 8, her head bleeding heavily, her face pale as paper. Her mother collapsed to her knees right there, crying uncontrollably. "Please, doctor, save my daughter." Marcus reviewed the scan, his chest tightening. The injury was severe. The odds of survival were slim. And yet the girl's wide eyes, though dazed, still tried to find her lips moving. "Mister, can you save me?" He clenched his fist, suppressing a sigh, then stepped into the operating room. The lights blazed again. The instruments moved with the same precision as always. But this time, nothing went smoothly. The girl's blood pressure dropped rapidly. The bleeding wouldn't stop. Her heartbeat spiraled into chaos. The entire team did everything they could, but the line on the monitor stretched slowly toward flat. "We should call it, doctor," another surgeon said quietly. Marcus glanced at the clock. More than 2 hours had already passed in the attempt to save her, but his hands refused to stop. In that moment, the words he had spoken on the balcony the night before echoed back through his mind. If you're real, give me a sign. And as if driven by some invisible force, in the middle of an operating room filled with light and the noise of machines, Marcus, a man who had always mocked every form of prayer, whispered, almost soundlessly, "If you're real, please don't let this child go. Not for me, for her mother. She's still so young." No one heard him. His mask covered his mouth. The machines kept humming on, indifferent. Only he knew that he had just done something he would once have mocked without hesitation. He had prayed. 5 seconds, 10, 20. No miracle came. The line on the screen stayed flat. The child's heart did not beat again. Finally, Marcus lowered his hands, his voice hoarse. Time of death, 7:45 p.m. The entire team bowed their heads in heavy silence. Stepping out of the operating room, the mother rushed at him, grabbing his coat. "Where's my daughter? How is she?" Marcus looked at her, his voice catching. "We're sorry. We did everything we could." The mother screamed, collapsing to the floor. Her wailing echoed through the hallway, cutting into Marcus like 1,000 blades. He walked away in silence, feeling strangely hollow. No sign at all, he thought bitterly. That night he dreamed again of the long hallway and the broken statue, familiar now. But this time, he didn't run, didn't scream as he had before. He simply stood there, watching the dark red liquid seep from the statue's cracked body, and whispered, "Why didn't you save that child?" The next morning, the whole hospital was abuzz. The mother of the girl who had died the night before had gone to the church across the street to arrange a funeral mass for her daughter. The parish priest, Father Andrew, a man in his 50s with a calm bearing and kind eyes, heard the story and came to the hospital himself to pay his respects. Meeting Marcus in the hallway, he offered a warm smile. "Hello, doctor. I'm Father Andrew from the parish across the way. Things have been hard at the hospital lately, haven't they?" Marcus nodded, keeping his distance. "Hello, Father. Yes, always hard." Father Andrew studied him a moment, then said gently, "I heard that yesterday you fought to save a young girl right up until the very last moment," Marcus answered, irritation edging his voice. "We always try. Not every case succeeds. I understand that. And I haven't come to blame you. I've come to thank you. That mother just told me she believes someone was present with her daughter, working through your hands until the very end." Marcus frowned. "But the girl died. How can she say something like that?" Father Andrew smiled, tinged with sorrow. "Because for that mother, what matters most isn't only whether her child lived or died. It's that her child wasn't alone in her final moment. That there was a doctor there. That there was faith there. For her, that was enough." A pause settled between them. Then Father Andrew continued, "I've also heard from a few patients that you don't believe in spiritual matters, that you once damaged a religious symbol. Is that true?" Marcus stiffened, his heart beating faster. "If you've come here to preach at me, Father, you don't need to. I'm busy." Father Andrew chuckled softly. "I haven't come to preach. I've come to tell you one thing. No matter how many symbols you break, what those symbols represent has never once broken you." The words sounded strangely familiar, almost identical to what Daniel had said. Marcus spun around, staring at the priest as though trying to see straight through him. "Who told you that?" "Someone you saved. He told me about a dream in which someone said words like that. I can't say for certain where it came from, but I know it touched something in you." Marcus was silent for a long moment, long enough that Father Andrew didn't press him. Finally, he sighed. "I prayed, Father, do you know that? In the operating room, an atheist doctor prayed, and no miracle happened. The child still died. So where was your God in that moment?" Father Andrew didn't answer right away. He looked toward the window, where the light in front of the statue in the churchyard still glimmered, even though the sun had risen. "Do you think, doctor, that the greatest miracle isn't someone being healed in body, but a heart that had gone numb learning again how to feel pain, how to weep, how to bow?" Marcus gave a thin, mirthless smile. "Are you saying I'm the miracle?" Father Andrew smiled gently. "Last night when you prayed, even though no one in that operating room heard you, I believe that prayer didn't fall into nothing. The girl's mother may never know it, but perhaps what was meant to be saved that night wasn't only a life. It may have been your own soul." Marcus laughed, but the laugh carried a tremor of grief within it. "But I failed." Father Andrew shook his head. "There's no failure for someone who dared to love with everything he had, doctor." You did everything medicine allows. What happens beyond that isn't always a miracle in the way we'd want it to be. Sometimes the miracle is a mother finding a way to forgive the circumstances, a child allowed to leave in peace, and a proud doctor finally willing to admit that even he has limits. The words settled into Marcus quietly, without fanfare, like drops of water slowly soaking into ground that had gone dry for far too long. He said nothing for a while, then asked softly, "If I wanted to apologize, where would I even begin?" Father Andrew looked at him for a long moment, then answered gently, "There's a place people call confession, if you ever want to go there. But before that, perhaps you should begin by apologizing to the person you hurt first, the woman who held that statue that day." That afternoon, a scene unfolded in the hospital hallway that drew more than a few glances. Dr. Cole, the man known throughout the hospital for his near-cruel coldness, walked quietly over to where Rose sat praying the rosary, the mended statue beside her, the crack still visible despite careful repair. He bowed his head, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry, what I did that day was wrong." Rose looked slightly surprised, then smiled, her eyes warm with kindness. "You saved my grandson. I was never angry with you. I've been praying for you every day since." She lifted the statue gently. "He has forgiven me so many times. I'm sure he forgave you long ago, too." Marcus looked at the crack in the statue and realized that, though carefully repaired, the fracture remained visible, like a scar that could never fully disappear. But strangely, that very scar made the statue feel more real, more alive than it had before. Proof that something once shattered could still be made whole. "Then," he whispered, his voice so faint he wasn't entirely sure he'd spoken aloud, "if it's possible, please mend my heart too." That evening, for the first time in his life, Dr. Marcus Cole walked through the gates of the church across from the hospital. He stood quietly at the back of the sanctuary, unsure what to do next, simply looking up at the large statue placed above the altar. In that stillness, he thought he heard a voice whisper, very softly, within him, "I have never broken you, though you once broke my image." Tears, he thought, had long since dried up, after years of facing suffering and death in his profession, spilled out without warning. He bowed his head, no longer wanting to argue, no longer needing to prove anything. Perhaps the ending for a man who once mocked a sacred statue wasn't a terrible accident, an incurable illness, or some severe punishment. Perhaps that ending was, in fact, a beginning, the beginning of an awakening, of a heart choosing humility before something far greater than itself. Something he had once dismissed without a second thought. And somewhere in the familiar hospital hallway, amid the eyes of patients, amid the mingling of tears and laughter, amid the church bell ringing every evening, everything took on an entirely different meaning. Because from that day forward, every surgery Dr. Cole performed carried, alongside his sharp scalpel and deep medical knowledge, one more thing, a small, quiet whisper spoken in his heart before he ever stepped into the operating room. "Please, be with me in this room." Years later, once he had risen to department chair and his hair had begun to gray, Marcus still kept that habit. Younger colleagues sometimes wondered aloud how a man once known as the hospital's most fervent atheist had become its most patient, its gentlest presence, especially with patients and families who carried religious faith into their hospital rooms. He never fully explained his story to anyone, except once, when a young doctor asked him why he had changed so much. Marcus only smiled, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the church tower across the street could be seen faintly, tolling its familiar evening bell. "Because I once broke something whose value I didn't understand," he said, his voice calm and steady. "And I learned that some things, even broken, never truly lose their power. The only thing that can truly break is a heart that refuses to be healed." The young doctor didn't fully grasp the depth of what he meant, but she noticed one thing. In the eyes of the department chair, once rumored to be the coldest man in the hospital, there now shone a peace no medical textbook could ever teach. And every evening, when the bell across the street rang out at 6 o'clock, people would see him pause for a moment in the hallway, listening quietly, as though greeting an old friend who had walked with him through an entire journey of awakening. A journey that began the very moment he believed he had lost everything, but which, in truth, was the moment he began to find what mattered most.